wise is just to look at the coffees you're buying, make sure that they actually serve a purpose, that you can maybe look at a substitution so that you can have less green coffee and then you can actually use it a little more efficiently. You have more throughput, so you have more turnover in inventory. There's a lot of efficiencies in that. Optimized workflow. Before I actually got into coffee, I had the benefit of working in a warehouse that it was a collating warehouse. So it wasn't coffee, it was actually whatever people needed to have packaged. And it was an incredibly enriching experience because we had a warehouse actually about twice this size, and we had very few fixed items within there. We had like I think a drill press and shrink wrap machine and like a palletizer. Every day, every week, it depended on the project, we would just get parts. It could be like a notebook and some folders that we have to assemble with some pins, and it might be like a gift basket or it was a care package for somebody. We received all of the pieces, and then I was challenged to come up with the best workflow, like how you can start this and then go to the next step, and the next step, and the next step, and do it in the least amount of effort, the least amount of space, using the least amount of people. Not that I don't want to employ people, but it was about efficiency. It was about laying out how things work and then following that flow so that you're not having to go back and forth a lot in your movements and I've seen coffee roasters that send the green up and then roast down, and then the coffee goes back up and it gets ground down, and it goes back up and it gets packaged, and it's like you can just you know that if you had carte blanche and you could start from scratch, you wouldn't have that at all. And that's some of what I've done is just we tend to in coffee roasters you just grow, and then you add another thing in your plant, and you add another thing and another thing. You don't really do it in a way that like, what is ultimately 5 years from now, am I going to have something that would need that space? Well, I need another roaster. So what I generally do is kind of look at like what needs to be in here, and like for instance, this room there's like 3 posts, so your open space. What we tend to do is just look at what exists and believe that that's what we have to work with. So I encourage everyone to kind of think about like the future growth, do capacity analysis. There's a couple of things I'm going to hit on in a second. It's about leveraging other industries. So I'll go over contingency planning. I've met this a couple of times where a roaster catches fire and you cannot roast coffee. I would encourage to have a contingency. Reach out to the roasting community, local people who can actually roast your coffee and do the same, so that if you have an issue, if you have a hurricane somewhere in the East Coast, that you can actually, someone can roast your coffee, or that you have some way to continue your business so that you have this in place before you actually need it. It's a fire drill, but I think it's totally necessary. The last thing, again, the coffee industry, people get here so many different ways. I was a cultural anthropologist, and then I went into forensic anthropology and science, and then I had a culinary interest and ended up in coffee because I wanted to be a beer brewer, and it doesn't make sense. But in this course, I've joined different organizations over the years just because coffee is your procurement, your quality control, your R&D. I worked as an R&D coffee scientist. I worked as a process engineer. We're process engineers, we're quality control people, we're research and development people, we're coffee scientists and food scientists, procurement people, supply chain management, logistics. There's a lot of organizations out there, and I do encourage, as much as there's awesome specific coffee knowledge in the coffee industry, and there's a lot of people that you can talk to and leverage like excellent information, there's also organizations that I've cherry-picked from, and I know we have a discussion later about beer brewing, and that's actually of interest, but I did sit on a sensory panel with a beer company and learned a lot about sensory through them. I was a guest, I was the only one from outside of the company that was able to join, and I learned a lot about our own defects. We share a lot of the same defects. And that was incredibly, insightful. So again, I would just encourage people to like define your function, and then you can explore it a little further, find out if there's other certifications outside of the coffee industry that might help you There's a lot of untapped resources, I think, and the coffee industry we're having a lot of deeper, I guess, technologically advanced conversations now in coffee, but there's still some work, and there's still places to explore. Yeah, that's all I
Yes, thank you.
All right. You can keep the microphone on, please. Was that a good way to stress a bit? If I just stand here and look a bit nervous, did that work for you? Did you understood that I wanted you to round off?
Yes, I got that. Thank you. Very subtle.
Okay, so I will ask you a question and Tim will do something. I have many questions, but we will let the audience here as well give them a chance. What would you say is the most common mistake you see when you're out visiting smaller roasteries and craft roasteries concerning the topics you talked about here?
All right. Is this back on? Yeah. The thing I see often in smaller coffee companies, smaller roasteries, is it's a bit like I've had a couple of friends that were musicians and excellent musicians. They get in the studio and they have all these got a whole panel of effects they can play with, and they overproduce. They believe that everything that's available to them needs to be used, and it's kind of like filtering a photo, and you filter everything and it looks distorted and like a watercolor. What I see is actually two things, but they're linked. One is that a lot of people find themselves overwhelmed with all of the scientific and I guess like engineering complexities of roasting coffee, of everything that they've read and the numbers they feel like they need to hit, and they're overwhelmed. I worked with a company that I think it was partly their culture. It was Upper East Side, New York, so they didn't have a lot of time, always stressed, but they just were overwhelmed with the numbers that they had read and what they felt like was what they needed to do in their roasting and in their cupping and TDS, and it was just overwhelming. And I think that a lot of people get overwhelmed with what they believe they need to do. And in some ways, I think coffee is actually really easy. But once you understand where the complexities are and where the really high-stake variables are, it's really a pretty simple